Tonight, the Whistleblowers Attorney is pushing back after President Trump alleged the whistleblower is a, quote, strong Democrat. NBC News correspondent Ken Dilanian is with us now. Ken, what do you know?
Katie, the whistleblower's lawyers just issued a statement pointing out or saying that their client has never worked for or advised a candidate or political party and has basically spent a career working as an intelligence professional in the government. And the reason that's important is because in his initial description of the whistleblower, the Inspector General of the intelligence community did say that there was some indication of political bias in favor of a candidate. And in recent days, the Washington Examiner reported that that political bias involved a professional relationship with the current candidate. And people jumped to conclusions, including the President of the United States, that somehow this whistleblower was involved in politics. But if you think about it, Joe Biden was the vice president. This person's been in the intelligence community. Perhaps this person had some interaction with the vice president, briefed the vice president. Regardless, the bottom line here is that the lawyers are saying that this whistleblower was not involved in politics, had no role advising any of the Democratic candidates. So the idea, as Donald Trump has been putting out in recent days on Twitter and elsewhere, that somehow this whistleblower has a political axe to grind does not appear to be the case.
Ken, you might not be able to answer this question, but I wonder if the whistleblower or his attorney are reconsidering or even considering whether this person should come public and put a face and a name and a job title to the allegations that the person made.
Everything I've heard from the lawyers and others familiar with this matter is that the whistleblower does not want to do that. The whistleblower really wanted to maintain his status as a career government official serving his country in the intelligence community, and coming forth into this political hothouse and would be the antithesis of that. And we don't even know if this person is undercover, which would make it even more complicated and would really foreclose the idea of him being identified. So my sense is that no, the whistleblower doesn't want to do that. But you may have a point that we're leading to a momentum here. I mean, further details are coming out that are narrowing down the group of people and allowing people within the government to identify this person. So it may be inevitable that their name comes out.
And Ken, I know we were talking about this yesterday, but the Democrats were trying to potentially hide the identity of the whistleblower from their Republican colleagues. House Democrats were thinking of trying to do that. Has a decision been made on that? Is that still potentially in the cards? Do we know when the whistleblower might speak to Congress?
My sense is that those discussions are still ongoing. But yes, there is a very real concern on the part of the Democrats that the House Republicans are essentially agents of Donald Trump and can't be trusted with this information, the whistleblower's identity. There is no similar issue, by the way, in the Senate, which is also expecting to hear from the whistleblower and investigating this matter. No concern that Senator Richard Burr or any of the Republican senators would inappropriately reveal information.
Ken? Why is that?
It's just a much different situation. Senator Burr, who is not running for re-election, is trying to run a bipartisan process. He tried to do it in investigating the 2016 election, and he's trying to do it now. And he has a close working relationship with the ranking Democrat, Mark Warner, who has made his own set of compromises, who has not been as partisan as sort of on the attack as Adam Schiff on the House side has been. But it's just senators obviously are elected by states. They're less partisan. It's a much different place, Katie.
I've been talking to an administration official, Ken, who's been telling me that this idea that Ukraine meddled in the election is just complete insanity, that this is basically a fever dream of the president, what he wants to happen, that it's not supported in the intelligence community. I know you have conversations with intelligence sources all the time. Can you give me an idea of how they're reacting to this entire spectacle?
Yes. I mean, among the many conspiracy theories about this whole saga, this is one of the more outlandish from everything I've been told by sources. And my sources are aghast that this information, that the president is clinging to this idea and sort of using the mechanisms of government to investigate it. The idea that somehow a server that we know was hacked by the Russians, because the intelligence community told us and the FBI told us that somehow that could be found in Ukraine and potentially, the Ukrainians were actually involved and not the Russians. It's just bananas. And nobody I know in the intelligence community believes that. Katie.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.